Hello everyone and welcome to episode number 7 of the Game Out Talk podcast. My guest in this episode was Kamil Jodelko. The 31-year-old is a generalist for Event Horizon and lives in Poland, and also is a contributor for Dekogon as a 3D artist. Hey Kamil, super dope after meeting you at the Gamescom booth to have you now on my show.
Hey man, nice to be here. Thanks for inviting me to the podcast.
Maybe you could give a short introduction of yourself for the listeners. It's kind of a common thing at my podcast.
Sure, man. So my name is Kamil Jodelko. I live in Poland. I'm 32 years old, actually.
Oh, you turned 32. Okay.
Yeah, that's no problem. I can be 31, even better. So I've been doing 3D for about 4 years now, and I've been doing it professionally, meaning working at a studio in-house for about 2 years, a little bit more than 2 years now. So should we get into how I got into 3D, I guess?
Yeah, because you're a kind of a late starter in the industry, because you had like another career before all this game development stuff. So how did you make your way into the industry, and what was the reason mainly to switch industry and to kind of get your life in another direction?
Yeah, so actually I love this question for a variety of reasons. So I don't know, I think I have a story that applies to many people, I guess. Mm-hmm. So before I started doing 3D, my whole life had been dedicated towards the study of foreign languages.
As you can hear.
Yeah, thanks. So from a very, very early age, my parents made sure that, I knew foreign languages. English, obviously, was the first language that I picked up. So I have more than 10 years of teaching the language under my belt, and that includes like teaching in private schools, language schools, tutoring and lecturing. So I ran a one-man language school for about 2 years, but I got really tired and burnt out, because 10 years is a lot of doing something.
So
right?
why did you get burned out? Was it the work you had to do, or was it too much work you had to do?
It's the latter, actually.
Okay.
I had a lot of students. I had a lot of customers, and you have to realize one thing: if you teach, and let's say you work, 4 or 5 hours a day, it might seem like not much, but in reality you also have to spend additional time at home to prepare, because every person is different. You have to kind of tailor your approach to different people. So I was working about 8 to 10 hours a day doing the same thing for about 10 years. That was, I think, the main reason for burning out. And I got to a point where I said to myself, okay, we got to stop, because I love languages, I love learning, I love teaching, but I am burning out. So if I stop now, if I take a break, I don't begin to hate it, right? Because the thing I was afraid of, I was really afraid of it, was if I do it too much, and if I burn out too much, then I will never come back to it again. So I wanted to break, right? And there was an opening in like an international marketing company. It was email marketing. So I got the job, and some time passed, and the company decided to put my skills to use in conducting marketing workshops around the world. So United States mostly, but other countries as well. And after 2 years of doing that, it was, I don't want to say it was easy, but it was simple. Meaning I kept doing the same things over and over again. I kept explaining the same things. So I burnt. I don't know if calling it burning out is good. I got bored of it, really.
Yeah.
So I got really frustrated with myself, because apparently something was wrong, right? You do one thing for some time, burnt out. You pick up another thing. 2 years pass, and you're like, this is boring. So, and also the whole idea of like get a higher education, because that's what people do. Get a job even though it's not your dream job. You got to make money. Yeah. The pretty common thing.
Pretty common society.
It really started getting to me. So, I kind of like inside I started feeling empty. So, wasting my time in life doing stuff I didn't even really like that much. So one day after work, I just came home, sat down, and started thinking, like, okay, what do you like doing? I like sitting in front of the computer.
Okay.
Right. I like play.
That's a
Yeah,
good
I like
starting point.
yeah, I like playing games and doing stuff like that. So, what can you do that's profitable and it involves sitting in front of the computer? So immediately, like I thought of coding because I used to write code when I was like 15 years old, but that's not really interesting. And then I remembered, okay, like 2 or 3 years after The Matrix, the original movie came out, I made a very simple animation, like in Maya, in the very early versions of Maya.
Oh, yeah.
Because it was about like, I don't know, 15, 16 years ago, I guess. And it was like a bullet time animation. The scene where Trinity shoots one of the agents, right? And I thought of that, and I thought to myself, hey, that was interesting. I remember having a lot of fun doing that. So I downloaded Blender, I think. That was the first program I used. And I started like modeling. And it was like love at first sight. After about a week, I knew that this was the thing I wanted, to do. And to answer your original question, which was, you started a little bit late, right?
Yeah.
How do you get into the industry when you start that late? So after like making a couple of very simple objects in 3D, like cups, mostly like very simple meshes, I started posting it on my Facebook, and I got asked by a friend, like, is this a hobby or what? Or are you planning on doing this professionally? Because this looks quite cool and fun. And I was like, oh man, I want to do this professionally. And he immediately came back to me with an epic, it's too late for you. You're 28 or 29 years old, man. It's really too late. You'll be competing with people who started when they were like 15 or 16, right? And they've been doing it for ages. So I knew I wanted to do this professionally, but I lacked experience. So a decision was made to kind of overcome the experience gap with hard work. And I started just working and studying like a monster. It was like 14 to 16 hours a day. So 8 hours at the marketing company, and then the rest was learning hard surface modeling, doing tutorials, applying feedback for about 1.5 years. I basically erased 1.5 years of my life to dedicate myself fully to this. So I stopped learning and teaching languages. I stopped playing the guitar. I stopped playing the piano. I even stopped like doing active exercise, because back then I was like an active gym goer. It was like 5-6 times a week. And I just stopped. It's good that I have a very tolerant girlfriend.
That's
she
good
kind
to
of
have. Yeah.
She kind of managed through that. But after 1.5 years of this hectic approach, I got a job at my first 3D studio. So it is possible. You just have to dedicate yourself to it. But it's definitely possible. If I manage to do this, everybody can do it.
Yeah. So this was not the intention of my question, to clear this out. So I didn't want to say that you're late order, but you definitely are. But this is never, just for the listeners, this is never a problem if you can be a game developer with 55 if you want to. You really need to be good. It's not a ages thing anymore.
Yeah.
So
I just wanted to throw in it's not an age thing anymore, because you have a ton of resources available within the hand's reach. You just Google whatever kind of lesson or tutorial you want to find, and you just start learning. That's it.
Yeah. So you switched from Blender to Maya. Was there a specific reason? Was it like for the studio, or did you like Maya more?
So it's actually a good question. The reason I switched wasn't First of all, I switched before I started working at a studio.
Okay.
So, and the reason for that was there weren't that many good tutorials for Blender, and there were a ton of good tutorials for Maya and 3ds Max.
Oh yeah.
So
yeah.
and also when I browsed ArtStation and what's the name of the other one? CG Society, I think, is the other one. I kept seeing that people in the industry used either Maya or 3ds Max. It was kind of like a conscious decision, like, oh, so if this is the industry standard, perhaps I should also pick this up. And back then, when I was learning, it's still a good resource. It's called Pluralsight. It's it used to be called Digital
Tutors, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I just kept doing tutorial after tutorial after tutorial.
Okay, so you just bursted through the tutorials and soak it up like a sponge.
Yeah, so the reason I switched was basically there were more learning materials.
Okay. So it was not a software-specific reason, it was like more of a tutorial learning-specific reason.
Yeah, that was the original reason, yes.
Okay. I see on your ArtStation portfolio that you are a generalist. So how do you become a generalist?
So the first studio hired me as a 3D artist, mostly a prop artist.
Uh-huh.
So I kept doing props for games, like weapons, buildings, the general kind of thing. And then the second studio that I got hired at, and the reason for quitting was that the second studio was much, much closer to home. So it was a good choice, actually. It's an indie studio. So one of the reasons, it's not the main reason, but one of the reasons you have to know the whole pipeline if you want to work at a 3D studio that's an indie studio is because it's very simple. There's very few people in a studio like that, so the workload is kind of different. So they were looking for somebody who could model texture, who could build a scene in Unity, who knew something about level design, compositing, so like the whole pipeline versus just creating assets. Unfortunately, the first studio actually taught me that, so I passed the test and I started working as a generalist. So just to break down the responsibilities, right, that I have as a generalist, it's the full asset pipeline. So modeling, sculpting, UVing, baking, and exporting textures to the engine, so texturing and then exporting the textures. So that's one. The second thing is creating procedural materials with Substance Designer for the 3D team. Then it's building scenes in Unity, so level design. And then it's lighting these scenes and actually preparing it for gameplay. It also involves a little bit of rigging and animating the props that it's not rigging and animating characters. We have a character artist for that, but the environment also is usually alive, right? It's not a static object. So rigging and animating as well. Testing the game, and that would probably be the most, if not all of the things I'm responsible for.
So you would say that like the generalist is more needed in a indie studio, because like in a huge studio you have for every specific task you have like a single person who can do that?
That would be my guess. Yeah. Because if you look like at big AAA studios, they usually have like hundreds of people working for them, and they have very specific roles for each part of the pipeline. Right. If you take a look at recently, I think I've read something about grinding gear games. These are the guys responsible for Path of Exile.
Oh yeah.
So that they even divide their 3D artists into high poly artists and low poly artists. Right?
Really?
Yeah. That was
is
pretty
crazy.
Yeah, especially since Grinding Gear Games is not like a very big studio. I think that it's like about 100 or 150 people. But they do have the division between, high and low poly artists. So that was quite interesting.
If you would say like this would be at Ubisoft, that would be okay. Yeah, they can afford that because they are so huge. Like, but oh, that's crazy.
Yeah.
So let's come to one of your latest projects, the Lee Enfield. Everybody was liking it on ArtStation and looking at it, and you tried to be as close to the reference as possible, as you mentioned already at the project. Can you tell me something about your workflow a bit?
Sure, man. No problem. So when it comes to weapons, or actually any model that I create, first things first, and this is like a very cliche thing to say, you just surround yourself with references. And actually, after I posted the Lee Enfield project, I got a couple of questions about how do I approach modeling something as complex as the Lee Enfield's receiver, which is a pretty complex piece of hard surface modeling. So the way I approach collecting references for weapons especially is the first thing I search for is the blueprint that has the name of all of the pieces that make the weapon. Okay? So then after I have that, I decide which pieces are the ones that will be visible to the player or to the person looking at the model, and I just get rid of the rest. And once I have the names of the pieces that I need, I search for each of these pieces individually, and I search for the references of the model as a whole. So that's the first step. So usually it's about anything from 50 to like 150 references, I guess, something like that, because weapons are usually, they consist of many pieces, right? So once I have that, I go to the low to mid poly, I guess, block out, because some of the pieces are like modeled out using traditional hard surface modeling, meaning subdivision modeling techniques, right? So the stock or the wooden pieces are fairly simple, so we can just use sub-D for that. Then if you want to approach something like the receiver, doing that using traditional sub-D modeling skills, then that would be a pain. So I use a workflow.
Boolean.
Yeah, it's a pretty popular workflow nowadays, right? I think Simon Fuchs popularized it a lot recently. Although it's a much older workflow. I think it's been around since 2012 or 2014.
Okay.
I think the guys that did weapons for The Division explained it during a GDC, how they approach the Boolean workflow. So the Boolean workflow basically consists of creating small Boolean objects, the big object, the model itself, and then you throw that into ZBrush, you Boolean everything out, and you pull the high poly back into your 3D software. So you have both the low poly and the high poly that's ready to be UV'd and textured.
So that's what I wanted to ask. So if you make the Boolean, you make the Boolean in high poly in the high poly in ZBrush, which is pretty clear, and but the low poly, you also you kind of use the same objects, but you Boolean it out in Maya or something, right?
Oh yeah. So let me actually break this down. Mm-hmm. So you have the main object, which is the one that you cut out from, and then you have the small Boolean objects that you use to cut out with. And these objects have to be subdividable. So whenever I create these pieces, because it's very simple geometry. There's just a lot of it in individual pieces, so it's very easy to create them in a way that they have clean topology and they're easily subdividable. The reason for that is, if I have both the low and high poly of the small pieces I use to cut out with, I simply save the low poly version of them in Maya for the low poly, I send the high poly version of them to ZBrush. Okay, so I can cut out clean and very round shapes in ZBrush. And then, so basically I perform two operations. I use the low poly objects to boolean out from the low poly piece, and then I use the subdividable high poly pieces to cut out from the ZBrush part in ZBrush. And that way I have both pieces very quickly for free. And usually if you spend a little bit of extra time doing that, if everything is done correctly, UVing a piece like that is just very simple.
Yeah, that's true. Okay, so you kind of make your low and high poly now. What do you go next? You're going to make your UVs in Maya?
Yeah, you're still using Nightshade UVs.
You're using the Nightshade, okay.
Yeah. So I do the UVs, which is usually a fairly quick process.
Yeah.
There's nothing like, it's not rocket science. You just have to learn how to properly pack your UVs. Try to avoid like dirty looking UVs. The pieces that you can have aligned to either a vertical or horizontal line are the best because there's no pixelation during the bake. Yeah. Obviously, you will have some organic or round shapes. It's unavoidable. You could probably like straighten them out, but then you'd get stretching on the textures. So you don't want that. Try to take up as much UV space as you can. If you can go above 90%, that's just gold. But it depends on the model. Sometimes it's impossible. Then you bake, and my go-to baker is Marmoset. It has been like that for at least 2 years now. Substance Painter actually updated.
Yeah.
The way they bake.
They're getting better.
Yeah, but it's still Marmoset painting the cages and, you know, correcting the skew and the offset. That's just, it's second to none.
Yeah.
So once I go through the bakes, depending on how complex the model is, baking is the process where you can learn where you make mistakes. So when you see artifacts from time to time, you will see artifacts, you know, oh, okay, I messed up this little part here. And it's also very important to spend extra time once you have the model baked in Marmoset or Painter to inspect if you have artifacts or not. Because once you're done with baking and you start texturing and you realize, holy shit, I made a mistake here, you have to go back to baking.
And so much more back and forth and wasted time.
Exactly. So spend the extra 5, 10, 15 minutes even, like just rotating the model around, looking at it from every angle. And once the bake is clean, you throw it into Substance Painter and the real fun begins.
You also streamed on Twitch, right? You streamed your completely texturing process on Twitch.
Yeah. The complete texturing process, as well as the high poly process, I believe that the whole UVing. I didn't stream like baking and because it's boring.
Fairly boring and waiting. So is it still on Twitch? Are there clips of it, or can the listeners still view it or watch it?
No, I only stream live. The reason for that is I play music in the background that's not
gotcha.
That is copyrighted, and if I posted a clip like that, it would just immediately get muted or just taken down. So.
Okay. How many texture sets did you use for the Lee Enfield? If that's not secret, if you wanna.
No. Of course, it's not a secret. So normally you use one texture set for the weapon, and one texture set per attachment. So
per attachment, okay.
Per attachment, yeah. So let's if you take an example of, let's say, Metro Exodus, right? The game. That they obviously have to use different texture sets, texture sets for their weapons because they're modular, right? So if you're modeling classic rifles or classic weapons, that would be one texture set for the body of the weapon, so the whole rifle. If it has a scope, that's a separate texture set, and if it has any sort of like additional attachment, like a sling, or I don't know, a flashlight, but not for a World War II weapon, obviously, that will also be on a separate texture set. So the Lee Enfield, I made a small adjustment. I separated the receiver from the body, and the reason for that is if I create a different receiver, I don't have to go through baking and UVing everything on the main body again, because I will at some point in time want to create the MK1 version. And the main difference between the MK4 and the MK1 is the receiver. Yeah, so I separated the receiver, so it's one texture set for the body, one texture set for the receiver, scope, and sling. So it's 4 instead of 3, basically.
Okay, that's super nice. So is there anything you wanna tell the people about your Anfield? What were the main problems for you on this task?
Yeah, so well, the reason for the Lee Enfield rifle to begin with was I wanted to track my progress after a year of modeling and texturing, right? Because a year ago I did the Mosin Nagant rifle, which was pretty okay, I guess. This time I wanted to get really close to the reference. Right. So the main feedback I got from like Dekogon when I kept talking with Duarte or others was like, show me your references, show me your references. Okay, is this in your opinion close enough, or what would you change? So I was like, okay, let's try getting as close as possible. So I basically divided the stream in 3 major components, I guess. The first one was the wood. The second one was the metal, and the third big part was the polishing passes, right? So I do use a lot of wizardry or trickery when it comes to, for instance, texturing wood to get that nice feel, and that involves a lot of like basic texturing, obviously, where you get your base, fill layers, and then you start adding fibers, you start using color variations, roughness variations, so on and so forth. But then once you get further down or further up in the layer stack, I should say, I begin to use real images, like high resolution images from, let's say, the rifle I want to texture. I throw that image into Photoshop and I just extract alpha masks from wood fibers, for instance, right? Okay. And I get like 5 or 6 different variations of the wood fibers. It's very simple. You just throw the image into Photoshop, you turn it into black and white, and then you use levels to crunch up and down the black and white values until you get the patterns you want to extract, or you can use color selection for that as well. So once you have a couple of interesting alpha masks, you throw it back into Painter, and then you add that extra realistic detail. Because if you have the alpha masks, you can just throw them in as a you add a fill layer, you add a black mask, you add a paint layer, and then you just paint the alpha. You can use it as a folder, and then you can throw additional cool variations inside that folder, and it will only affect the fiber pattern of the weapon or anything that is not a fiber pattern. So I used alpha masks on the Lee Enfield. I used alpha masks for wood fibers and the black blotches or the black dots of dirt or grime, I guess. That's why it has this kind of realistic feel to it, I guess. Apart from that, one interesting thing I could mention here is whenever you're doing color variations, instead of just using fill layers that you throw in a grunge mask and then you just play around with the color, use a normal layer with a black mask and a grunge and just add a filter that's HSL. The reason for that is the old way of doing color variation, every time you change the base material, you also have to change every single fill layer that you used for color variation. If you use the normal layer and you set it to pass through and you add a filter that's HSL, every time you change the base layer, since it's passed through NHSL, it adapts to the base color. So every time you change the base color, every single stack of the color variation changes along with it. So you don't have to do it manually. I think that's a very popular way of doing color variation nowadays. So once we got through the wood, I went to texture the metals. Oh, and by the way, let me just quickly list, like for anyone listening, how I approach texturing anything. It's base color, it's color variation 2, 3, depending on how many I want to have. It's usually 4. Then I do roughness variations, again 2 or 3. If it's wood, then I start adding the fibers. Then I start adding discoloration. Then I add like a sun fade effect, because that's what usually happens to wood if it's outside for a long time.
Yeah, and to plastic as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Plastic, the same thing. So once I have this, and this is usually about anything from 10 to 15 layers, then and only then do I move to layers like macro detail or micro detail, which is scratches and grunge and grime and dirt and dust. The reason I'm mentioning this is after the Lee Enfield project, I was just bombarded on Discord with questions like, "Oh man, that was an awesome, awesome weapon. Could you look at mine and tell me, this and that?" And a thing that I've noticed is people, if they're new, once they have a weapon ready for texturing, they go straight to micro detail. They have like a base color, like they add something and they go straight to edge wear, and they go straight to dust and dirt. And like I kept saying the same thing, like go back to your base material. Once you have your base material ready, then move on to the micro and macro details, which is scratches and edge wear and like chipped off metal or wood and stuff like that, because that's supposed to be the cherry on the top. It's not supposed to be the base of your texturing. So yeah,
that's pretty deep into texturing, Kamil. That's super dope. I think everybody can take something from it.
I'm very happy to hear that, man.
But on the other side, I heard you on the Gamescom booth talking about level design. As you being a generalist, is this also on your list of skills? And yeah, maybe you can give a glimpse about that.
Sure, man. So level design is something I do, or actually did. I haven't done level design for a month now. The reason is I just managed to convince our leads to just allow me to do props and props only. That's what I love. But I did level design for quite some time. So a couple of interesting things, I guess, you might pick up whenever you're playing games or looking at games or watching gameplay on YouTube or on streams, is how level design is approached by professionals. And that involves, well, first of all, there's a couple of questions you have to ask yourself. Okay, are we playing a grid-based system game like XCOM or Divinity, or is it like an FPS, so on and so forth? The reason you need to ask yourself these questions is you will approach reusability of assets in a very different way. Right? So if you take a close look, if you play games, you will see that, especially in the background, you see the same assets, just reused in different ways, different scales, different rotations, so on and so forth, right? So the way at least we approach level design is, I think this is pretty standard in the industry nowadays, is you block out your level. So you use white boxes as space holders for assets, right? You test it out in the game. So whether it's an FPS or whether it's like a RPG, just test it out on white boxes, see if the covers are placed okay. The covers being boxes, obviously, they're not assets yet, right? You can throw in some lighting to add a little bit of mood. And once you have that, you move on to actually bringing the level to life. And this consists of a couple of things. The environment itself, right? So texturing the surface that the characters move on, whether you're using vertex paint for that or whether it's like Diablo 3 was made. I don't know if any of the listeners here had the chance to look at the models from the game itself or themselves, but the way Diablo 3 was made, it was quite interesting for me to learn, was that they had a lot of, first of all, it was a grid-based system, right? It was a lot of repeating or repeatable patterns, but the way they dealt with adding variety to, let's say, the ground, so that the player didn't notice that it's just the same pattern tiled into infinity, was they used a ton of alpha masks, right? So you had a lot of decals or decals added to the ground that covered like 80% of the floor or 70% of the floor. So that's the first thing you do, right? You get the floor or the surface that the game's played on. Once you have that, you begin modeling out the assets. And depending on the game you're making, you have to think, okay, do I use trim sheets? Do I use kit bash sets for assets? How many individual or hero assets can our engine afford, or can the memory afford? So these are all like individual approaches that, you know, determine the performance of the game. Then you obviously throw that stuff in. You play around with lighting to bring the scene alive, and I would highly recommend, if you're studying 3D, or if you're new to 3D, or if you're interested in level design, I would highly recommend at least once take a glimpse of the color wheel and understand how colors complement each other, whether it's like an analogous or like a complementary color set, because you can bring an average scene to life using good lighting, and you can kill an amazing scene with bad lighting. So it's also pretty important to spend some time learning how to light scenes. And then, for instance, our game, Dark Envoy, or Envoy actually, the one we're making right now at Event Horizon, it's like an XCOM/Divinity kind of game. So we have covers as well, and this is a huge element of level design, especially for games that are turn-based, because the way you lay out everything determines the outcome of the battles that are being fought on these terrains. So how many covers? Yeah, exactly. It's very tactical. So how much of open space can you have, or how many covers should you place? Where to place obstacles? How obstacles are different from covers? So on and so forth. So it's a lot of fun to do that. Although for me, it's like it misses the vital component, creating the stuff that you use to build the levels with. And this is something I prefer much more than just using these assets to create levels. So.
Okay. So you kind of supported your team with being a level designer, or did you? Okay. So you're now back to your old love, making just props.
Yeah, exactly. Well, props and environments.
Okay, so also doing environments.
Yeah. Which is more fun than I expected, to be honest.
Okay. So do you have your own engine? Or,
No.
Or are you developing in Unreal?
The game is being developed in Unity.
Okay. Nice. Okay, are there any tips for starters, like who look at your portfolio and they are like, oh my god, I want to make this, I wanna be as good as Kamil, and I want to start out in the industry as an artist? Is there any few tips you can give to young people, as you being not so young anymore? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. No, no problem, man. I guess, well, there's a couple of things, like make sure that this is what you really want to do. Because
Yeah.
this industry, and as we talked before, this isn't my first job. So throughout my life, I've had the chance to actually taste a little bit of, well, not a lot, but some industries that are different from this. And this particular industry, the 3D industry, it has a very high entrance bar.
It really
So-
has, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't know if based on my experience, from what I've noticed, I think it's much more difficult to get from nowhere to a junior position than it is from a junior position to a mid-level, and then from a mid-level to a senior. So just getting a foothold in this industry is quite a tough thing.
Yeah.
So you got to make sure that this is really what you want to do, because it will take time to get good, and at the beginning you will suck. Everybody does. We all do, right?
Yeah.
You should probably taste a little bit of everything. So not only go like, oh, I want to be a generalist, I want to do everything, or I just want to make characters. Man, I know people who started out as character artists because they thought that was what they wanted to do, and they ended up in the industry as VFX artists because that was what they truly loved. So try a little bit of everything before you actually decide to just sink your time into something. And once you decide, okay, I want to be a 3D modeler, right? A 3D artist. I want to do props or weapons or characters or vehicles, whatever. Use tutorials at the beginning, at least to familiarize yourself with the software. Use tutorials. There's a couple of things I can recommend highly. And they're very cheap, like subscription-based tutorials. So for instance, if you go to Pluralsight, if you want to start learning modeling, a quick start to modeling in Maya, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4 are great. Like automotive modeling in Maya, if you're into vehicles, is also cool. And then once you get a grasp on what modeling really is, what edge loops are, what proper topology actually means, you can get into a amazing tutorial, which I always recommend to people who struggle with shading. They're like, oh, I messed up the topology here, I don't understand why. There's an amazing series that is called Tips for Modeling Complex Shapes in Maya 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's a very cool set of tutorials that teach you how to look at the surface and kind of analyze the way it's built. So when you look at something, you're thinking of the topology, that it's cleanly subdividable, which is very important in this industry too, for working efficiently. And once you're done with the basics, you can then branch out to, because you will develop a flavor by that time, like, oh, I want to do this or I want to do that. So once you're there, you will just probably go to Gumroad. Everybody ends up at Gumroad at some point, looking at individual tutorials, whether it's the AK-47 if you're into weapons, or from Tim Bergholz or the Simon Fuchs or handgun, or if you're into substance designer, you'll inevitably end up buying Daniel Tiger's designers tutorials, or what's the other?
Josh Lynch?
Yeah, thank you, Joshua Lynch, exactly. So you'll start buying individual tutorials, going through them, and in the meantime, one crucial piece of advice. This is regarding a question I got asked recently. When you're doing tutorials, make sure that you learn how to do the thing you want to do, and make sure that you're not learning how to do tutorials.
And how to copy stuff.
Exactly, like, oh, he used the value of 0.75, let me just mindlessly copy that, because what you end up with is you end up with a piece on your portfolio that everybody has and everybody knows, and you don't have the skill to actually apply what you've learned in your next project.
Yeah.
So there's a way that, because I caught myself doing that.
Yeah, I was when I was starting, it was the same person as you just said.
Yeah, so there's a way to. I learned. It was during my first year, I think, when I was into 3D. I kind of developed a way to brute force your way through that problem.
Yeah.
Let me just take the AK-47 as an example again. You have that tutorial. Okay, so he's doing an AK-47. Let me take a different weapon that's very similar, but it is different from that weapon. And that way, you will not be able to copy the same values or do the same thing. You will force yourself to think how to solve problems versus think how to replicate.
And how to analyze stuff, you know?
Exactly. So, because you will be comparing stuff. So, I think that's a pretty valuable thing.
This is pretty important, yeah.
By that time, you'll probably be very well on your way to, you know, getting your first job, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty good. And always build up a good portfolio. Just quality over quantity, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, that's true. So every now and then you should just simply wipe your portfolio.
It's hard. Personally, it's hard to wipe up stuff, but yeah, in the end, it pays out.
You will be judged by your worst piece.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, Kamil, I think we just wrap it up.
Sure.
So it was pretty nice to have you on my podcast, and I guess the listeners can take very huge skills and information from your talking. Please make sure to follow up Kamil on ArtStation and on Twitch, so you can watch him live doing all the magic stuff. And yeah, Kamil, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on your podcast, man. And
it was amazing. So it was our second attempt to inform the listeners, because the first one was so bad in quality, but we really wanted to make it. So this is our second attempt. So thank you so much, Kamil.
Thank you, man. All the best, Chris. Cheers.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.